Thanks so much for having the two of us here today. And I want to thank Betsy and Nick for helping to coordinate this visit with us. So we're going to talk today about how we got here into doing work for education justice. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that work in our classrooms and also how we do that work outside of our classrooms across the city. So in 1963, James Baldwin wrote in his talk to teachers, "We are living in a very dangerous time. To any citizen of this country who figures himself as responsible, and particularly those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke." And so those words are just as true now as they were then. And we both come to this work with the sense that teachers really need to take an active role in the work for justice in our city and our society. So I grew up in media and went to Pencrest High School, so just down the road. I experienced tracking in my high school career, so I was in higher level classes, which at Pencrest, like many other schools, was very segregated. Both my parents were public school teachers and union activists, so I kind of grew up around that when I was younger. I ended up going to UNC Chapel Hill, and I studied African American Studies, and ultimately wrote my thesis on the Black Panther Party in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And so coming out of college, I knew I wanted to be involved in community work, and I thought at that time that teaching was the way to go with that. In retrospect, looking back, I think that I came at it with a bit of a savior mindset back then. That I'm gonna come in and fix things and change things and save people. And I've definitely come past that, but I think that's where I started. And I started working in charter schools in Philadelphia. So my early work was in charter schools, and I had some really terrible experiences. From a professional standpoint. So I worked in one of the Renaissance charter schools, which was basically a stolen public school that was turned into a charter school. The only reason I could get a job there was because it was a place where I could go without an official Pennsylvania certification. So I worked there, and during that year, which was my first year of teaching, my father passed away, and I was asked by the school to not return for the following year. So despite the fact that it was my first year teaching, and in September of that year I had a major trauma, they didn't care. Sorry, your performance wasn't good enough, goodbye. I worked at a second charter school, and at that school we attempted to unionize amongst ourselves as a staff. They ended up firing our leadership. The following year brought in a new leadership, and those of us who were involved in the union drive were basically bullied persistently throughout the school year. And so that is what brought me into the school district, and that is part of the reason why I think union work, which we'll talk about later, is so important to me personally.
Good morning. My story and my journey into education kind of started in 4th grade, which is weird, isn't it, to say that. I used to have a bad stuttering problem, and my parents moved us out to the suburbs, to pursue a better education for me and my sister. Well, one day in class, the teacher asked everybody a question, and I raised my hand, eagerly trying to answer it, and she called on me, and I started stuttering. The class started laughing, and she's like, "Don't mind him, his people talk like that." And this was in 4th grade. The librarian at the school heard about it. I told my parents. My mother is Black and from England, and my dad is Puerto Rican and Dominican, but he always called himself Ismael Jimenez, just to put that in perspective. So when the librarian heard about it, she gave me her original copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X in 4th grade. And I read it in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. By 6th grade, kids would call me Ishmael X for some reason. But I definitely, at that point, didn't really place too much importance on formal schooling and more on education, the experiences that we have, the people that we meet, and who we talk to. So as I went through school, I actually ended up coming back to the city and going to Roosevelt Middle School for a little bit, and then after 1 year that wasn't that good, my mom moved us back to the suburbs. I ended up getting kicked out of school in 8th grade for my behavior, because I would have fun getting kicked out of class. It's stupid as I look at it now, but So I ended up graduating with a 1.6 GPA. And at the time, the counselor was like, "Are you sure college is right for you?" I was like, "Yeah, what are you talking about? I'm going to go to community college, I'm going to go to Temple, and I want to teach in Philadelphia." And she's like, "You think about trade school or something?" I'm like, "I know what I'm doing." And mind you, I didn't even take the SATs because I thought they were culturally biased. I remember telling myself that, but I never tried it. So I ended up graduating with my bachelor's from Temple after completing at community college. Unfortunately, I was just married and had our first child, so I couldn't do the student teaching free thing where you have to like work 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, and don't get paid. So as a result, I ended up working at Project Rainbow, which is a transitional housing for women and children, and I was the administrative coordinator for pre-K. And that I did for 3 years until I eventually was able to get my master's, do the student teaching, sleep on the floor in between things, and start the process of actually becoming a teacher. My first job was at Germantown High School. I taught there the first 4 years. I picked it. I loved it. I lived around the neighborhood, and then it was closed. And right before it was closed, I found out I was laid off. And that kind of woke me up to the importance of actually being active, to actually speaking up. And I got interviewed by a couple of students at the time, and I said, you know, closing schools and neighborhoods, this is a reflection of a larger politic that is going down. And as that process and my experiences from there forward have dictated, has influenced me to kind of know that not just in my classroom can this work needs to be done in educating people, but outside of the classroom. So I just wanted to kind of like guide you through that whole process. But right now, for the last 7 years, I teach at Kensington Kappa in the Kensington section of the city. And I love it just as much as Germantown. It took me a little bit longer to love it, but I do. And it inspires me when I'm in my classroom and I tell my students to like stand up for what you believe in. I need them to point to Mr. Jimenez and be like, he actually walks what he talks. And that guides me ever since I was a child.
Thank you. Yeah, so Ismael's experience, and I think mine too, like connect to sort of the context of Philadelphia schools. So just like in setting the groundwork, I just wanted to go over just some stuff about the profound injustice of what's happening in Philadelphia schools right now. So as Ismael mentioned, in 2013 there were mass layoffs and 23 schools closed. Charter schools have exploded. There are 87 now in Philadelphia. And oftentimes they reinforce socioeconomic and racial segregation of schools. They siphon off a lot of engaged students and engaged parents from public schools, and also they directly take money from public schools. So part of the reason we're in the financial situation we are is because of charter schools. We've also experienced a decline in the amount of teachers of color in the district. So right now the school district teaching staff is 68% white, 23.5% black, and 3.4% Latinx. So, and those numbers have shifted into being more white over in recent years, and part of that is due to layoffs. Part of that is due to closures, because a lot of the teachers who have been affected by that are teachers of color. And then the building conditions. There was a report that came out that said about $5 billion in repairs are needed to actually, and that's not to modernize buildings, that's just to fix everything that's broken. And then the average age of a building in the school district of Philadelphia right now is 70 years old. And so, you know, we've seen some influxes of a few $1 million here and there from the state and from the city to fix the buildings, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not enough. And then I just want to mention, last week we saw this story about Mass Charter School. I don't know if anyone else saw this, in the Northeast, who has built this state-of-the-art building. Meanwhile, they serve a student population that's 70% white. And that's public money. That's the school district of Philadelphia as well. So we see this inequality emerging in that realm. And then a couple more things, just an overemphasis on testing. The number of benchmark tests and state exams and everything is getting out of control. A lot of it's like moving into online software that we're being forced to use with our students. And then finally, an overemphasis on policing over counseling and restorative practices. There are more school police officers in Philadelphia schools than there are counselors. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. Not really related to discipline per se, but there are only 8 certified school librarians working in the school district of Philadelphia right now. So Ismael's experience with his librarian, right now so many kids are not having that experience. And as of last year, metal detectors are now mandatory in all Philadelphia schools. So there are a few schools without them, but now they're required, whether or not the school community wants them. And so this is like the context within which we're working and within which our classrooms lie. So we're going to talk now about just some of the things that we do in our classroom to get our students involved in this work for justice and to push back against a lot of what's happening outside our classroom within our schools.
So my focus as an educator in Philadelphia, I consider it lucky. We're the only city that requires African American history for graduation requirement. And that provides a space to go over like a counter narrative of the usual, mythological history that we're told about, a lot of things within our society. So in that space, I'd like to consider it a crawl space, a space where you can experiment with ideas and present history that might not be talked about in the mainstream as much, but is as valid in as American history is American history. So I go about doing this through critical dialogue. I believe, like Paulo Freire, that teaching and education is a two-way street. That if we just simply go into the classroom and think that we're going to input some knowledge in the kids' heads and they're going to regurgitate it and live life perfectly, we're neglecting the back and forth, which is part of our human existence. So when we engage in that critical dialogue, we engage in what's called intersubjectivity, where if you're really listening to what the person says, you have to consider what they're saying valid to them and vice versa. And through those conversations, can we get a deeper understanding of what we're looking at? And so that's the philosophical orientation how I run my classroom. Now at first I was all about just putting desks in rows, and I made a thing called a study guide where I would put all the information for the students and they would have to look at PowerPoints as I taught. But over time I realized that's an ineffective way of educating. And I didn't realize that most students learn more 30 minutes in the cafeteria during lunchtime than they do all day in the classroom. When I asked my students how many of y'all got an A in a class, they didn't learn nothing, but you were well behaved. Almost every single child's hand goes up. And this is terrifying, the fact that too many students read at 4th or 7th grade reading level and don't really get past that. And if you read the Philadelphia Daily News or the Inquirer, you can tell that the Daily News is written at 4th grade level and the Inquirer at an 8th grade level. And that's just the reality of the society in which we live in. That reading is not fundamental anymore. So I always emphasize reading of text. And there's a quote that I use at the beginning of the year that always messes with the kids' head. If you travel down the river of tears in the boat of broken promises with heavy fall, how can you be clear exactly what your knowledge is? So how do you know what you know is really what you know? Who taught you that? How does it influence the way you see others? And then how does it influence the way others see you? And I throw that at them constantly to the point that they start repeating it. And then I kind of think, well, how do you know that? How do you know I'm not trying to indoctrinate you right here? And see, all these type of conversations are meant to cause the student to take a pause and why do I believe what I believe? Who taught me who I am? And what path or what journey or what perspectives are out there that theorize on these ideas? And in African American history, that becomes a perfect place, because we're dealing with people throughout history that have wrestled that and wrestled with their role in this larger society. So as the class has gone on now, my students sit in groups of 5. I encourage dialogue. I even go and sit down with them and be like, how do you know that's true? When they try to tell me something that they think I want to hear, I'm like, okay, what about this argument against that? How would you argue against that then if that's what you believe? And see, this is the process. This is what we should be engaging on inside and outside the classroom. And that's how outside the classroom my work really is dictated by. That I'm not coming in there in accusatory, I know what's everything, knowledge and stuff, because a wise man that knows something knows that they know nothing at all. And we have to reach back to that humility, reach back to the fact that there's a lot of people who talk about things that don't know anything about what they're talking about, but that doesn't mean they can't learn, and that you can't learn from them. So that's how I orient my class.
And I think I approach my classroom similarly. I teach in a humanities context, so mine is a little bit less. Ismael's one of the best content teachers I know. He engages students in it, and he knows his stuff. And I'm not. That's not as much my approach. I know my stuff, but I'm not as much about content. I've been encouraged by my principal to do more project-based learning and less content-based learning, which I think both have huge amounts of value. And I wish I was a little bit better at content. But I'm just going to talk to you briefly about how I do projects with students. And so, I won this award a couple years ago from teaching tolerance. I was talking to Nick about the name. They don't really like the name either. They're kind of trapped in the name because I think tolerance is not really what we're looking for. We're looking for justice. So I just want to put that as a side note. But there's a lot of very useful things from them, and so they divide social justice teaching into 4 domains: identity, diversity, justice, and action. And so I think a lot of that frames the way I approach projects in my classroom. At first, in my early part of my career, I think I did a lot of identity and diversity projects. So when I actually worked with Ismael at Kensington Kappa, and I worked with a media arts teacher to do this public art project that hung up around our school in Kensington. Students took photographs of themselves and then did a variety of writing about how they see themselves, about how other people see them, and about what made them the person they are today. And we combined that with photography and hung it up in the neighborhood around the school. Again, a really great public art project that got students to explore identity and got students to think about diversity of their classmates. But at that time, I wasn't as much engaging students in justice or action work. So the students did the work and then we put it up. But then that was kind of the end of the project at that point. And so I'm still doing that type of creative work where students are able to express themselves in creative and interesting ways. But I've tried, I'm in charge of senior project at my school for the 3rd year. And I'm really trying to take that work to the next step and get students to really think about, now that I have expressed these things, now that I've reflected, now that I've seen what's happening with me and my peers, what can I do about it? And so we orient our senior projects around this idea of wicked problems. The social science term from the 70s, but we've kind of reoriented it for us. And so students focus on something that's really close to them and that impacts their lives and their communities. And so most often they're inspired by the experiences of themselves or someone very close to them. So a close friend who was shot and killed, parents who have struggled with addiction, a younger sibling who faces street harassment. And so they create a portfolio of work and then present their work. And what I'm working on right now is trying to get them more into what can I do now that I've put this together and how can I take this out into the world with me. And so that's a little bit about what we do in our classroom. And we're just going to sort of end by talking a little bit about what we do citywide. Because especially in the time we're in, but in any time, it's not enough for us to just do really great stuff in our classroom with students. We're both, I think, firm believers that we need to work also on our own to change the conditions that our students are facing in schools and communities. And so we've both been involved in teacher activist structures, both inside of our union and outside of our union. And so the first group that we've both been involved in is Teacher Action Group Philadelphia. It's a group that's been around for about 10 years. We just had our 10th anniversary last year. And basically like trying to transform the culture of schools, engage teacher leadership, and really make them bottom up rather than top down organizations. A lot of what we do through Teacher Action Group is teacher-led inquiry groups, teacher-led book groups, teacher-led learning spaces where we're really developing our knowledge and then going out and applying it to make some change. And one of the organizations that actually grew out of one of those inquiry groups is the Caucus of Working Educators. Ismael's going to talk briefly about that.
So the Caucus of Working Educators has been around for the last 5 years. In Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers is the largest union in Philadelphia and the second largest in the state. Now imagine if socially justice-minded people had their hands on those resources and allocated those resources in the city to really strengthen the communities in which these schools operated in. And that's the theory behind the Caucus of Working Educators, that we're affiliated with what's happening in Chicago, with LA, across the country. And we have learned from them and they have learned from us. And the purpose is just how can we push our union leadership right now to be more socially justice minded, and how can we compete against them in the future to potentially take over power and then hopefully shape the way the city is operating in.
Yeah, and so through our work in the caucus and through our work in TAG, we've both facilitated a large number of book groups on a whole bunch of different topics. But much of Ismael and I's work has centered on anti-racist work in schools. And so we've both sort of taken this work and begun to form additional organizations that are doing that work further. So I've been involved for the past 3 years in this organization that we've called Building Anti-Racist White Educators. Our understanding is that we as white teachers need to take an active role in building anti-racist schools and classrooms and ultimately colleagues. And that should not be the sole responsibility of teachers of color, that too often in our schools it's the teachers of color who raise issues of racism and white supremacy, but we as white teachers feel that we need to engage actively in that work as well. So we've sent out a monthly inquiry series that goes to around almost 2,500 teachers across the country that's encouraging them to develop inquiry groups in their schools, to consider the role of racism and white supremacy in their schools and how they can work to actively change it. So we're entering our second year of this inquiry series. We actually just sent it out this morning. And so, that's really exciting work that has built off of a lot of this teacher activism and organizing work in Philadelphia.
An organization from ITAG, so just to tell you what type of think tank this is, TAG created the Caucus of Working Educators. Charlie's Baldwin group came out of that, and I, with a couple other teachers, helped form the Philadelphia Black History Collaborative. Now, like I told you, African American history is a required subject in Philadelphia to graduate. Unfortunately, a lot of people walk into the classroom with no background on that. So maybe they know about Jet Magazine and Al Sharpton, but they're lacking knowledge on African American history. I'm just being silly. So for the most part, the organization was formed to kind of provide resources and PDs for teachers who want to know and how to approach the subject, but might maybe never have been introduced to critical content associated. Another thing, another organization that has also come out of it is called the Nominated Educators Collective. And that is an attempt to build a network of Black and brown educators across the city to focus on issues that particularly affect them, and at the same time create a network where they're also able to work with other organizations that our society hasn't fully reconciled. So I think some of the work that the TAG has come out of, and mind you, these came out in book clubs, these came out what we call inquiry to teacher action groups, and all of it's organic and has involved teachers on levels that they never really have been engaged in before.
And so a lot of this work has culminated in the Black Lives Matter Week of Action in schools. And so we were inspired by a Black Lives Matter Day of Action that happened in Seattle in 2016, in the fall of 2016. And so we had our first Black Lives Matter Week of Action in Philly schools in January of 2017. And then for the past 2 years, it's been a national week of action, 20 or 30 cities?
Yeah, over 30 cities last year.
Yeah, over 30 cities last year were involved, and so we're entering the third year of the National Black Lives Matter Week of Action this year. And that's really a goal to put this anti-racist work on the forefront of the work that we're doing. And so a lot of Ismael and I's work is how can we have our union do that as well. And so we have a contract coming up this year. Our contract expires in August of 2020. We have a union internal election coming up next year as well. So it's a big year on the sort of teacher level, on the teacher union level. And so one of our big goals is how can we make this a central conversation of that work for a new contract and of ultimately our internal union politics.
And just need to stress enough that like we are dealing with things right now in our time and age that that are coming to a precipice, and we have to be honest with that. And so when we're talking about like being in our classrooms and doing the good work there, I challenge teachers and I also challenge other people to realize that work has to happen in our everyday lives, who we interact with, that person that your family member that just disagrees and just likes to argue for the sake of arguing. Start picking holes in that argument and coming up with your own. And the more you do that, the better you get. Malcolm Gladwell in Outliers talks about Tiger Woods wasn't born automatically the best golf player. It took years and hours of practice. And so when I think about the work and practice that we put in a classroom and engaging in authentic relationships with our students and real conversations, those type of things can be taken out of the classroom and applied everywhere. And I just want to challenge you guys also, ones of good heart and who care about this stuff, to actually pay attention to what's happening in schools. Pay attention to the conversations that we're having amongst each other about creating a better society.
So thanks so much for giving us the space to talk. And we're both going to be sticking around afterwards for a conversation, so we look forward to talking to you. And we have some handouts that talk a little bit more about what we're looking for, a community-based process around what we're looking for in the contract that centers justice. So we look forward to talking to you afterwards. Thank you so much.